She stood at her husband's funeral, knowing she faced an impossible choice. If she lived in 1829 India, they might expect her to climb onto his burning pyre and die with him. If she was Victorian English, she'd spend the next 2 years suffocating in poisonous black fabric, locked away for months, treated like she was already dead. If she was in China, she'd gain honour by never remarrying, but spend decades as basically a prisoner of her in-laws. Tonight we're diving into the darkest widow traditions in history, and trust me, this gets way worse before it gets better. Before we get into this heavy stuff, get comfortable, grab some tea, turn the lights down, settle in for the night. If you're new here, hit subscribe for more dark history stories. I'm genuinely curious. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from and what time it is. I love seeing how this community spans the globe. Some of you are probably getting ready for bed. Others might be starting your morning commute. Wherever you are, whatever time it is, welcome. Let's explore some seriously dark history together. The widow's impossible choice. Picture this woman in 1829. Her husband just died. She's grief-stricken, probably still in shock, but instead of being allowed to mourn in peace, she's facing decisions that could literally kill her. This wasn't about grief. This was about control. Across 3 different cultures, India, Victorian England, China, societies had developed these elaborate systems to control widows. And when I say control, I mean everything. Their bodies, their property, their futures, sometimes their actual right to keep living. Each culture had its own twisted logic. The widow's impossible choice. In Victorian England, she'd face 2 years minimum of what they called widow's weeds. Sounds innocent, right? Wrong. She'd be wrapped head to toe in black crepe fabric, and this stuff was literally poisonous. The dyes contained arsenic. Women developed what doctors called crepe respiratory, lung irritation from breathing toxic particles. The veils were so thick they stained faces black in summer heat. Medical journals called them instruments of torture, and that was just the clothing. The social restrictions. Even worse, the widow's impossible choice. 3 months of complete seclusion. She couldn't leave her house except for church, couldn't accept visitors, couldn't issue invitations. Basically social death while she was still breathing. After the first year, she could slowly, and I mean slowly, introduce grey and mauve. Too fast, society would judge her as disrespectfully eager to move on. Meanwhile, widowers got 3 to 6 months maximum, just a black armband, and everyone encouraged them to remarry quickly. The double standard was absolutely brutal. The widow's impossible choice. But Victorian mourning was nothing compared to what happened in India. Sati, the practice where a widow would die on her husband's funeral pyre. The word literally means she is pure. By the 1820s, British records documented 500 to 600 cases annually. In Bengal alone, 575 women in 1823, some tied to posts so they couldn't escape, others walking voluntarily into the flames. The thing is, for many women, this horrific death seemed better than decades of surviving as a Hindu widow. The widow's impossible choice. Hindu widows faced a lifetime of punishment disguised as tradition. Shaved heads, only white clothing, 1 meal daily of plain rice, sleeping on thin matting, excluded from every celebration, including weddings, because they were considered inauspicious. Social ghosts, women with no children to support them, decades of servitude and stigma. When reformer Ram Mohan Roy interviewed widows, he found they consented to sati not just from religious belief, but from witnessing the daily humiliation other widows endured. Death seemed like escape. The widow's impossible choice. Then there's China. No burning pyres, but a different kind of prison. Virtuous widows who never remarried got honoured with elaborate stone memorial arches. Sounds nice? These arches still stand throughout China today, monuments to women who spent decades celibate, serving their in-laws, never allowed to build new lives. The honour came at tremendous cost. Remarriage brought deep family shame, so women faced a choice: lifelong celibacy and servitude, or becoming social outcasts. Neither option offered real freedom. The widow's impossible choice. Here's what gets me about all this. These weren't random cultural quirks. Every single tradition served the same purpose: controlling women's sexuality and property. Widows often inherited their husbands' estates. If she remarried, property might leave the family. If she managed it independently, she threatened male authority. So societies created these elaborate prison systems disguised as honour, grief, or religious duty. The widow's suffering wasn't a side effect, it was the point: control through systematic brutalization. The widow's impossible choice. Think about the psychological torture here. You've just lost the person you loved most. You're devastated, vulnerable, probably scared about your future, and instead of support, society hands you an impossible menu: death, poisoning, social erasure, lifetime imprisonment. Each culture convinced women these restrictions honoured their dead husbands, but really, they honoured male power structures that couldn't tolerate independent women. The widow's grief became everyone else's weapon against her. Her mourning became her cage. The widow's impossible choice. This is where our story begins tonight, with one woman standing at that crossroads, facing choices no human should face. Over the next few hours, we'll explore how these traditions developed, the women who defied them, and the surprising ways some widows found power within these very restrictions. We'll visit Victorian mourning rooms, witness the last recorded Sati ceremonies, and discover memorial arches to Chinese widows. Fair warning, this gets darker before dawn. But these women's stories deserve to be told. Victorian mourning begins. December 14th, 1861. Windsor Castle. Prince Albert collapses from typhoid fever at age 42. Queen Victoria holds his hand as he dies. What happens next? She plunges an entire empire into the deepest, most suffocating mourning rituals the world had ever seen. This isn't just about one woman's grief. This is about how personal loss became public law, how Victoria's broken heart created rules that would torture widows for decades, rules that could literally kill you if you followed them too closely. Victoria doesn't just mourn Albert, she disappears. For 3 years, she barely appears in public. She wears only black, sleeps in his nightgown under his portrait, keeps his room exactly as he left it. Fresh clothes laid out daily, hot water brought for his shaving. The woman who ruled a quarter of the world becomes a professional mourner. And here's the thing, when queens grieve, empires follow. What starts as personal devastation becomes the blueprint for how every widow across Britain and America must behave. Victoria mourns for 40 years. 40 years. Until the day she dies in 1901. She never stops wearing black, never remarries, never fully returns to her old life. And society watches every move she makes, taking notes. If the Empress of India needs 4 decades to properly grieve her husband, what does that say about regular women who want to move on after a year or two? The message becomes crystal clear: good wives mourn forever, or at least they better act like it. Here's how it works for regular widows. Year 1, deep mourning. You're socially dead, black everything. No shiny fabrics, silk, satin, velvet, all forbidden. Just dull matte crepe that looks like you wrapped yourself in funeral curtains. Year 2, half mourning. You can slowly introduce grey, maybe some white trim, but transition too fast. Society will destroy you. They're watching, they're counting the months. One day too early, switching from black to grey, and you're branded as heartless, eager, inappropriate. The widow's uniform is basically a costume of misery. Long black veil that hangs past your waist. Black widow's cap with streamers that announce your status to everyone. Black gloves. Black boots. The only jewellery allowed, jet. A type of fossilized wood that's completely black and looks appropriately mournful. No colour anywhere, no sparkle, no hint that you might still be a living, breathing human being with desires or hopes. You're a walking monument to your dead husband, and you better never forget it. The first 3 months, total isolation. You cannot leave your house except for church. No social visits, no accepting invitations, no hosting dinners. You're in social quarantine not because you're sick, but because your widowhood might be contagious. Friends stop visiting, invitations dry up. You sit in your black clothes in your darkened house and wait for permission to rejoin the world. Some women describe this period as living in a tomb while still breathing. The loneliness drives some completely mad. Break these rules and society destroys you. Wear colour too soon? Whispers follow you everywhere. Attend a party during deep mourning? You're branded as disrespectful, immoral, unfit for decent company. One London newspaper published the names of widows who violated mourning protocol, essentially creating a public shame list. Your reputation, your social standing, your children's marriage prospects, all destroyed if you step out of line. The pressure to conform is so intense that women literally risk their health to avoid social judgment. Meanwhile, men mourn for 3 to 6 months maximum. Widowers just add black armbands to their regular clothes. That's it. No isolation period. No fashion restrictions beyond that little black band. They're actively encouraged to remarry quickly, especially if they have children. Society celebrates the practical widower who finds a new wife within a year, but a widow who even thinks about remarriage before 2 years. She's a disgrace. The double standard is so obvious it's almost comical if it wasn't ruining women's lives. Here's what nobody talks about. The mourning clothes are literally toxic. That deep black dye, often made with arsenic, lead, mercury, other poisonous chemicals needed to achieve that perfect matte black that society demands. The fabric is stiff, heavy, treated with harsh chemicals and starches. In summer heat, women are basically walking around in chemical-soaked torture devices. The veils trap heat and particles against their faces. Medical journals start documenting something new, crepe respiratory, breathing problems from mourning clothes. Doctors are horrified by what they're seeing. Crepe respiratory becomes a real medical condition. The toxic particles from those deep black dyes fill women's lungs. The heavy veils cause facial rashes and breathing difficulties. One physician calls mourning veils veritable instruments of torture that leave black stains on faces and poison the air around women's heads. Medical journals document case after case of women becoming ill from their own mourning clothes. They're literally poisoning themselves to grieve properly. But society doesn't care. This is just the beginning. We've covered the basic mourning rules, the isolation, the toxic clothes, the impossible standards, but we haven't talked about the specific pieces of the widow's costume yet. The widow's weeds, each piece designed to signal her status, control her movement, and remind everyone, including herself, that she's no longer fully alive. Next, we'll break down every suffocating piece of the mourning outfit and discover just how thoroughly society could control a woman through fabric. The poisonous fabric. 1860. They called them the Black Years. Widows across England wrapped themselves in mourning crepe, thinking they were honouring their dead husbands. What they didn't know, their grief was slowly killing them. That jet black fabric everyone demanded, it was soaked in arsenic. Literally poisonous. Victorian society insisted widows wear these suffocating garments for 2 full years. But here's the twisted part. The deeper the black, the more arsenic it contained. And the more arsenic, the more proper your mourning appeared to be. Picture this fabric under a microscope. Crepe wasn't just black, it was chemically black. Manufacturers used arsenic-based dyes to achieve that perfect matte finish society demanded. No shine, no reflection, just dead flat black that absorbed light like a void. The production process, brutal. Cotton threads got twisted, heated, then treated with starch and gum. Then came the arsenic bath. Green arsenic powder mixed with iron created that coveted deep black. The fabric felt stiff, almost brittle, and every thread carried poison. Why arsenic? Because it worked. Other dyes faded to brown or purple in sunlight. Arsenic-based black stayed black. Victorian society valued permanence in mourning. Your grief had to look fresh for 24 months straight, so manufacturers kept dumping more arsenic into their dye baths. The fashion industry knew it was dangerous. There are records of factory workers getting sick, but demand was too high. Every respectable widow needed her crepe. The deadlier the fabric, the more fashionable it became. Ironic, really. Doctors started noticing a pattern. Women in mourning kept showing up with respiratory problems, coughing fits, burning throats, skin irritation around their faces and necks. They called it crepe respiratory. Medical journals documented case after case. Women literally choking on their grief. The arsenic particles would flake off the fabric, especially in heat. Every breath pulled poison into their lungs. Every movement released more toxic dust. And remember, these women wore crepe everywhere, head to toe, for months. Victorian mourning wasn't just social ritual, it was potential death sentence. Some widows spent more time sick than grieving. The irony cuts deep. Society demanded they prove their devotion by wearing poison. The more they suffered, the more virtuous they appeared. And if the arsenic made them ill, well, that just proved how deeply they felt their loss. Weakness became virtue. Sickness became spiritual purity. The deadlier your mourning clothes, the more society respected your dedication to your dead husband's memory. Meet Elizabeth, widowed at 32. Every morning she wraps herself in layers of poisonous crepe. Black dress, black shawl, black bonnet with its suffocating veil. The fabric scratches her skin, leaves dark stains on her undergarments. By noon her throat burns. By evening she's coughing up black particles. But she can't take it off. Society's watching. Her neighbours count the days. Remove the crepe too early, and she's branded heartless. Keep it on, and she might join her husband sooner than expected. Summer made everything worse. July heat turned mourning crepe into torture devices. The arsenic particles became more volatile in high temperatures. Widows fainted from heat exhaustion, while toxic dust filled their lungs. Imagine wearing poison in 90-degree weather. No relief, no exceptions. Some doctors begged their patients to at least remove their veils indoors. But proper widows refused. Social pressure outweighed medical advice. Better to suffer properly than mourn improperly. Better to die virtuous than live disgracefully. Heat made the poison more deadly. The weight alone was oppressive. Mourning crepe wasn't lightweight cotton. This stuff hung heavy, stiff with starch and chemicals. A full mourning outfit could weigh 15 pounds. Add the summer heat, the restriction of movement, the toxic fumes, and you understand why widows looked so frail. They weren't just grieving, they were being slowly poisoned by their own clothes. Every breath was a risk. Every step released more arsenic particles. Fashion was literally suffocating them, and society called it beautiful devotion. Society romanticized widow suffering. The more a woman struggled with her mourning clothes, the more pure her love appeared. Newspapers praised widows who bore their grief beautifully. What they meant was women who looked appropriately miserable. Pale skin from arsenic exposure, proof of delicate femininity, constant coughing, evidence of a broken heart, fainting spells, signs of proper sensitivity. Society turned poison symptoms into virtue signals. The deadlier the clothes, the more admirable the widow. Suffering became a competitive sport. Individual women paid the ultimate price. Some never recovered from their mourning period. Chronic respiratory problems, skin conditions that lasted years, early deaths blamed on weak constitutions. These weren't weak women, they were poisoned women. But Victorian culture demanded this sacrifice. Widowhood wasn't just about losing your husband, it was about losing your health, your comfort, your freedom to breathe safely, all to prove you were a good wife. Even in death, women served male expectations. Even poisoned, they smiled through the pain. Queen Victoria's influence made everything worse. When Prince Albert died in 1861, she embraced mourning crepe with religious devotion. 40 years of black clothes, 40 years of setting the standard. Her mourning became the empire's mourning. What the Queen wore, respectable women copied. Her grief became their blueprint for proper widowhood. And since Victoria never remarried, never shortened her mourning period, never questioned the tradition, generations of women followed her poisonous example. One queen's devotion became a million women's death sentence. Queen Victoria's 40-year mourning. January 22nd, 1901. Osborne House. The old queen lies dying, draped head to toe in black silk. At 81, she hasn't worn any other colour for 4 decades. Not since Albert died. Her bedside table holds his photograph. His clothes still laid out fresh every morning in rooms she's kept exactly as he left them. This is grief that consumed an empire. Because when the most powerful woman on earth chooses eternal mourning, the world follows. And what followed was suffocating. December 14th, 1861. Windsor Castle. Prince Albert collapses with typhoid fever. Victoria hasn't left his bedside in 2 weeks. She's 42, mother of 9, ruler of the largest empire in history, but right now, she's just a terrified wife watching her husband slip away. Albert dies at 10:50 p.m. Victoria's first words aren't about duty or empire. They're raw, desperate. "Oh, my dear darling." Then she kisses his forehead, and something inside her breaks forever. The Victorian age of mourning begins that night. Victoria's reaction stunned everyone. She ordered Albert's room sealed, his shaving water refreshed daily, clean clothes laid out every morning like he might return. She moved her bed into his dressing room, sleeping beside his empty bed for years. State business, postponed indefinitely. Public appearances, cancelled. The Queen, who once loved court life and ceremonies, vanished into Balmoral and Windsor, emerging only for the most crucial state functions. Her ministers panicked. The empire needed its queen, but Victoria was drowning in grief. Here's what nobody expected. Victoria never stopped mourning. Not after a year, not after 10. For 40 years, until her death, she wore only black. Every dress, every glove, every ribbon. She made mourning jewellery from Albert's hair, carried his photos everywhere, spoke to his portraits like he was still alive. Government ministers had to conduct meetings through her lady-in-waiting because Victoria couldn't bear seeing people. She turned personal grief into a 40-year performance of widowhood, and the empire watched, then imitated. Victoria's daily routine became a shrine to Albert. Breakfast in black mourning dress. Prayers at Albert's statue in the Blue Room where he died. She read his old letters aloud, asked his advice on state matters, even saved his spot at dinner tables. Courtiers described her as living with a ghost. She refused remarriage offers, including from Napoleon III. "I am married still," she'd say, pointing to Albert's portrait. This wasn't just grief anymore. It was a religion of remembrance that would reshape how an entire culture mourned. The empire noticed. If their queen wore black for decades, what did that say about proper mourning? Victoria's grief became the template. Middle-class families across Britain, Canada, Australia, India started extending mourning periods. What was once 6 months for a husband became 2 years minimum. Black fabric sales soared. Mourning jewellery industries exploded. Photographers specialised in memorial portraits of dead family members. Victoria didn't just lose a husband, She created a grief industry that infected 3 continents with perpetual mourning. The ripple effects reached everywhere. In Bombay, British families mourned longer than Indian customs required. In Sydney, mourning periods doubled. Women who tried to shorten their grief faced social punishment for being disrespectful or eager. Victoria's example gave moral weight to extreme mourning. Families competing to mourn properly, like their queen. Death became theatre, grief became performance, and widows, they became prisoners of their own sorrow, trapped by a royal example of mourning that turned personal loss into public duty. Victoria's adherence to mourning rules was military precise. Black ink only, black bordered stationery, black sealing wax. She banned colourful flowers from royal residences, allowing only white lilies. Court functions became sombre affairs, where laughter was discouraged. She measured mourning periods for different relatives down to the month. Cousins got 3 months, aunts got 6. Even her jewellery had to be jet, hematite or made from human hair. Victoria turned grief into a science of suffering that her subjects desperately tried to copy. The pressure on ordinary families became crushing. If Queen Victoria could mourn for 40 years, what excuse did anyone else have for moving on too quickly? Widows feared being judged unseemly if they smiled too soon. Children learned that showing happiness during mourning was disrespectful. Social calendars emptied as families competed to outmourn each other. Victoria's personal choice became society's expectation. Her grief wasn't just royal anymore, it was the measure by which everyone's love and loss would be judged. But here's what made Victoria's mourning so powerful. It felt genuine. She wasn't performing for politics or tradition. She was a woman who'd lost her best friend, her partner, the love of her life. Letters reveal her real desperation. Life has lost all charm. Her public mourning gave permission for others to express their own deep grief. In a culture that usually hid emotion, Victoria's open, endless sorrow validated everyone's loss. She made perpetual mourning not just acceptable, but noble. Victoria's death in 1901 finally ended the mourning era that consumed the Victorian age. But the damage was done. 2 generations had learned that proper grief meant years of black clothing, social isolation, and emotional performance. Wives had been taught that their love was measured by their suffering. Mothers learned that moving on meant betraying the dead. Victoria's personal tragedy had become society's prison, and across her empire, women were discovering just how suffocating that prison could be. The widow's weeds. Picture this. Your husband died yesterday. Today, you're standing in your bedroom, while female relatives transform you into something unrecognizable. First, they strip away every piece of coloured clothing, every ribbon, every bit of lace. Then begins the ritual dressing that will define the next 2 years of your life. This isn't just putting on clothes, this is putting on a prison, and every piece has rules. Specific, suffocating rules that society will judge you for breaking. Start with the widow's cap. Starched white cotton pressed so stiff it could stand on its own. Long black streamers called weepers hang down your back like funeral banners. The cap fits tight against your skull, no hair showing. Then comes the veil. Not delicate lace, thick black crepe that hangs to your waist in first mourning. Some widows wore veils so long they swept the floor. You can barely see through this stuff. Walking becomes guessing. Breathing becomes work. Now the gloves. Black kid leather that reaches your elbows. You'll wear these every time you leave the house for months. Eating becomes awkward. Shaking hands feels distant and cold. Your feet disappear into black boots with no decoration. No buckles, no buttons. Just dull black leather that makes no sound when you walk. Even your undergarments change to black. Because God forbid someone catches a glimpse of white petticoat beneath your mourning dress. Then comes the dress itself. Crepe. Do you know what crepe is? It's cotton treated with chemicals to make it completely matte. No shine, no reflection, no life. The fabric is stiff, scratchy, and here's the terrifying part, often dyed with arsenic to achieve that deep, dead black. Victorian women literally poisoned themselves to mourn properly. The fabric sheds particles. You breathe them in. Doctors called it crepe respiratory. Women developed lung problems from wearing mourning clothes. The weight is crushing. Layers of black crepe, heavy veils, starched caps. It's like wearing a tent made of cardboard. Summer becomes torture. The black absorbs heat. The veils trap moisture. Widows fainted regularly from overheating and restricted breathing. One woman wrote that her mourning clothes weighed more than her wedding dress and winter coat combined. She felt buried alive, entombed in fabric, walking around in her own portable coffin. Listen to Mary Thompson. Widowed in 1868, the veil makes everything dim and dreamlike. I bump into furniture in my own parlour. The crepe scratches my neck raw. My shoulders ache from the weight. But worse than the discomfort is the isolation. People cross the street to avoid me. Children stare and whisper. I've become a walking reminder of death, a ghost haunting my own neighbourhood. The clothes don't honour my husband. They erase me. That's what the widow's weeds really did. They marked you as contaminated by death, dangerous to be around. Society treated mourning widows like they carried some plague of sorrow that might spread. Invitations stopped coming. Friends found excuses to avoid visiting. You became socially invisible while being physically impossible to ignore. The black clothes screamed your tragedy to everyone while simultaneously making you unwelcome everywhere. It's psychological torture disguised as respect for the dead. The emotional weight matched the physical burden. Every morning, putting on those clothes reinforced your loss. The mirror showed you a stranger draped in grief. Some widows said the mourning costume made moving on impossible. How could you heal when your clothes forced you to perform sorrow daily? When strangers judged the depth of your love by how perfectly you wore your misery. The widow's weeds weren't about mourning, they were about control. Society had rules for everything. The depth of your black, the length of your veil, the width of your hem. Step out of line and face judgment. Wear silk instead of crepe? Scandalous. Shorten your veil too soon? Disrespectful. Remove your gloves in public? Shocking. You weren't just a widow, you were a walking performance of grief that everyone felt entitled to critique. The clothes made you a public mourner, your private sorrow turned into community theatre. Victorian medical journals documented the health crisis mourning clothes created: compressed lungs from tight bodices, skin irritation from chemical dyes, headaches from heavy veils, eye strain from looking through crepe, heat exhaustion from wearing black in summer, fainting spells from restricted breathing. Some doctors called mourning attire instruments of torture. Women were literally making themselves sick to satisfy society's expectations. Death clothes for the living, poisoning themselves to prove their devotion. But the widow's weeds were just the beginning. Once you were properly dressed as a mourning widow, once you'd been transformed into this suffocating symbol of grief, then came the next phase of your punishment, the part that would break even the strongest women, because wearing the widow's weeds meant you were ready for what came next. 3 months of something that made the uncomfortable clothes seem like freedom. 3 months when the costume wouldn't matter, because nobody would see you wearing it. When you couldn't leave your house. Picture this. Your husband dies, and suddenly you disappear. Not literally dead, but socially? Completely erased. 1862 Victorian England had rules that would drive you insane. 3 months, 90 days locked behind your front door. No visitors except immediate family. No parties, no dinners, no theatre, no church except for his funeral. You could look out your window at the world, but you couldn't touch it. The most brutal part? Everyone knew you were in there. They called it the seclusion period. Sounds almost peaceful, right? Wrong. This wasn't a retreat or a spa vacation. This was punishment disguised as propriety. The neighbours would whisper if they saw you peek through the curtains too often. God forbid you stepped outside for fresh air during those first 3 months. You were supposed to be grieving properly, which meant suffering visibly but silently. The house became your prison, and grief became your warden. Think about your mental state after just 1 week of isolation. Now multiply that by 12. Victorian widows weren't just mourning their husbands, they were losing their minds. Doctors started noticing patterns. Depression, anxiety, what they called nervous disorders. Women talking to walls, screaming at night, completely breaking down. But here's the twisted part. If you seemed too healthy, too composed, people questioned whether you actually loved your husband. You had to look broken. The mail still came. Bills, condolence letters, invitations you couldn't accept. Life continued around you, but you weren't allowed to participate. Friends would send cards saying they missed you, but they couldn't visit. Your own children might be sent to relatives so you could grieve properly. Servants whispered in the hallways. The silence was deafening. Some women said the loneliness hurt worse than losing their husbands. That's saying something. Here's what nobody talks about. The boredom. Grief is exhausting, but it's not constant. Between the waves of sadness, you had nothing. No books except religious texts. No music except hymns. No needlework except black embroidery. Women started counting floorboards, memorizing wallpaper patterns, having conversations with photographs. The mind needs stimulation. Without it, some widows started hallucinating. They'd see their husbands in empty chairs, hear voices calling their names. The irony was brutal. Society made widows invisible, but everyone was watching. Neighbours knew exactly how long you'd been inside. They counted the days. If you emerged too early, even for groceries, the gossip would follow you forever. Mrs. Thompson couldn't wait to finish her mourning properly. She must not have loved poor Charles very much. Your reputation, your future prospects, your standing in the community, all dependent on performing grief correctly. Some widows cheated the system. They'd sneak out at dawn, walk in back gardens, meet friends in secret. Underground networks of women supporting each other through the madness. Passed notes through servants, quick visits when neighbours weren't looking. They knew the rules were insane, but breaking them publicly meant social suicide. So they bent them quietly, desperately trying to maintain some connection to the living world while officially joining the socially dead. The 3-month mark was like parole day. You could finally attend church, accept 1 invitation per week, receive visitors on specific days. But here's the catch. You had to ease back slowly. Too much social activity, and people would judge you as eager to move on. Too little, and they'd think you were odd. You had to perform recovery just as carefully as you'd performed grief. Every appearance calculated, every smile measured. Medical journals from the period are horrifying. Doctors documented what they called widow's madness, complete mental breaks from isolation. Women who forgot how to speak to people, who couldn't handle crowds after months alone. Some never fully recovered. They'd spend the rest of their lives slightly off, damaged by the cure that was supposed to heal them. The treatment was worse than the disease. Grief became trauma because society demanded performance over healing. Meanwhile, widowers got 3 months total. Not 3 months of isolation, 3 months of mourning, period. They could work, socialise, even start courting again after a few weeks, if they were discreet about it. The difference was stark and deliberate. Men were encouraged to move forward. Women were expected to disappear. The message was clear: a woman's worth died with her husband, but a man's life could continue. This wasn't about grief, it was about control. But across the world, other cultures had even harsher expectations for widows. While Victorian women faced social death, women in other traditions faced literal death. The isolation of English widows seems almost gentle compared to what was happening in India, where widows weren't expected to disappear for 3 months. They were expected to disappear forever, some by climbing onto their husband's funeral pyre. Let's travel there next and see how widow traditions could get much, much darker. India's Sati tradition. The year is 1815. A dusty village on the plains of Bengal. The funeral pyre crackles in the morning heat, sandalwood and ghee feeding the flames. A woman approaches, her white sari pristine against the orange fire. She's 23. Her husband died yesterday of fever. Now the entire village watches as she takes her final steps. This isn't grief you're witnessing. This is Sati, the practice that expected widows to burn alive with their dead husbands. And what you're about to learn, it's going to stay with you. The word Sati comes from Sanskrit. It means she is pure or she is true. Think about that for a second. A woman's purity measured by her willingness to die, not by how she lived, loved or contributed to her family, by whether she'd climb onto burning wood when her husband's heart stopped beating. The earliest records we have of this practice, 464 CE in Nepal, but it really spread between the 15th and 18th centuries. British colonial records from the 1820s documented over 500 cases annually, 500 women, every single year. Here's how it happened. The husband's body would be prepared for cremation, laid on a wooden pyre soaked in ghee and oil. The widow, often having fasted for days, would bathe and dress in her finest wedding sari, white, usually, the colour of mourning. Family members, village elders, priests, they'd all gather, sometimes hundreds of people. She'd be asked 3 times if she truly wanted to ascend to heaven. 3 chances to back out. But here's the thing, backing out meant something worse than death. It meant becoming a social ghost. Let me paint you the picture of what life looked like for Hindu widows who chose to live. Your head gets shaved completely. You wear only white cloth, rough and plain. 1 meal a day. Plain rice, no spices, no flavour. You sleep on thin matting on the floor. You're banned from every celebration. Weddings, festivals, religious ceremonies. People cross the street to avoid your shadow because you're considered inauspicious. Bad luck walking around in human form. Your own children might treat you like a servant. This could last 40, 50 years. Imagine that existence. Now you understand why some women walked into those flames. It wasn't just religious devotion. It was escape. Ram Mohan Roy, the reformer who fought against Sati, watched these ceremonies. He wrote that women consented not just from religious belief, but from witnessing the distress in which widows are involved and the insults to which they are daily subject. These weren't acts of pure faith. They were rational choices between 2 impossible options. A few minutes of agony versus decades of social death. What would you choose? Seriously, what would you choose? But here's where this gets really dark. Not all of these women walked willingly into the fire. Some had their feet tied to posts driven into the ground around the pyre. Others were placed in bamboo huts with their husband's body, their legs bound to pillars so they couldn't escape when the flames reached them. British observers reported women trying to climb out of burning pyres, only to be pushed back in by long bamboo poles. Family members throwing more oil on the fire to speed things along. This wasn't always voluntary sacrifice. Sometimes it was murder. Different regions had their own horrifying variations. In Bengal, they'd ask the widow 3 times before lighting the pyre, a formality that made everyone feel better about what came next. In Gujarat and Rajasthan, women might sit directly on the pyre as it was lit, or walk into flames that were already burning. Some accounts describe women taking opium or other substances beforehand to dull the pain. Regional princes sometimes offered rewards to families whose women performed satya, turning tragedy into profit. The practice became a mark of family honour, status through suffering. The economics make this even more twisted. When a woman died with her husband, she couldn't inherit his property or remarry and take wealth to another family. Her death kept everything within her husband's bloodline. Convenient, right? Young widows with children were especially pressured because they represented the biggest threat to family wealth. Old widows without sons faced pressure because they were seen as burdens. The practice served multiple purposes. Religious devotion, yes, but also property control, population management, and keeping women from gaining independence. Death as financial planning. Some women became legends. Padmavati in Rajasthan, who supposedly led 13,000 women into mass self-immolation rather than face capture by Muslim invaders. That's jauhar, a related practice, but it shows how female suicide became romanticized as ultimate virtue. Temples were built at Sati sites. Stone memorials called Sati stones marked where women died, and people would worship there. The women became deities through death. Imagine that pressure. Die horribly and become divine, or live in misery and be despised. The choice between martyrdom and marginalization, between flames and decades of social torture. Here's what really gets me about this whole thing. High caste Brahmin women were often exempt from Sati because they supposedly couldn't benefit karmically from it. Their souls were already too pure. So the women with the most social protection, the most family wealth, the most education, they got to live. While lower caste women, women with fewer options and less support, faced the fire. Even in death, there was a hierarchy. Even in sacrifice, there was inequality. The practice claimed to honour all women equally, but somehow the most privileged women found ways to avoid it. British Governor William Bentinck banned Sati across British India in 1829, despite fierce opposition from those who called it cultural interference. But the practice continued in princely states for decades. The last documented case, 1987, Roop Kanwar in Rajasthan, 18 years old. That's not ancient history. That's during the Reagan administration. So before we move forward, understand this wasn't just about religion or tradition. This was about power, about who controls women's bodies, women's choices, women's very existence. And those battles, they're still being fought today, just in different forms. She is pure. Bengal, 1815. The sun sets over villages where widow burning has transformed from rare religious act to expected duty. Here's what changed, and it's darker than you think. What started as occasional voluntary sati among royal women became systematic pressure on ordinary widows. British records show a horrifying spike, 575 cases in Bengal alone in 1823. But here's the thing that gets me. Most weren't walking into those flames willingly. They were being pushed. Tonight we uncover how devotion became coercion. The word Sati means she is pure in Sanskrit. Pure. Think about that for a second. A woman's purity was measured by her willingness to die with her husband. But by 1815, purity wasn't about choice anymore. It was about family honour, community pressure, economic convenience. Ram Mohan Roy, the reformer fighting to end Sati, documented what he witnessed. Women weren't choosing death. They were being told death was their only honourable option. And if they hesitated, well, that's where the coercion began. Picture this scene. A woman's husband dies. Before she's even finished grieving, the family council begins. Relatives gather. Neighbours whisper. The pressure starts subtle. Your husband was so devoted to you. He would want you with him. Think of the family honour. But if subtle doesn't work, they get creative. Stories emerge of widows being drugged with opium before the ceremony. Others had their escape routes blocked. Some were physically restrained. The voluntary choice became anything but voluntary when families had reasons to want them gone. British officials documented the methods. In some cases, widows' feet were tied to posts near the pyre. They were asked 3 times if they wished to ascend to heaven. Sounds ceremonial, right? But witnesses reported women struggling against the ropes, screaming, trying to escape the flames. One British officer wrote of watching a young mother being dragged back to the fire after she jumped off. Her own relatives pushed her back. When sacred duty required family members to ensure a woman burned, voluntary became meaningless. But here's what made Sati seem like the better choice. Widowhood in 1815 Bengal wasn't just losing your husband. It was social death while you were still breathing. Widows had their heads shaved, wore only white rags, ate one meal of plain rice daily, slept on thin mats on the floor. They were banned from weddings, festivals, any joyful occasion, considered cursed, untouchable. Many families saw them as burdens consuming resources. For a young widow facing decades of this treatment, death might genuinely seem merciful. Social norms in 1815 Bengal operated like invisible chains. A widow who refused sati wasn't just defying tradition, she was challenging the entire community structure. Neighbours would ostracize her family, business partners might cut ties, marriage prospects for her children would vanish. The community had ways of making life unbearable for families who let their widows live. And here's the twisted part. If she eventually changed her mind and chose sati later, the community celebrated it as finally seeing the truth. The pressure never really stopped. Follow the money. That's always where these traditions get real. When a husband died, his widow inherited property, money, sometimes entire estates. But if she died, everything stayed with his family. No messy legal battles. No widow remarrying and taking wealth to another family. No woman controlling property that men felt should be theirs. Sati wasn't just about religion or tradition. It was about inheritance, about keeping economic power in male hands. Death solved a lot of financial problems for the families left behind. The coercion techniques were sophisticated. Families would isolate the widow immediately after her husband's death. No time to think clearly. No access to outside support. They'd surround her with religious advisors explaining her duty. They'd bring in other widows living miserable lives as examples of what awaited her. Sometimes they'd threaten to harm her children if she refused, or promise to care for her kids only if she chose death. Emotional manipulation wrapped in religious language, making the impossible choice seem like the only choice. Entire communities participated in this pressure. It wasn't just family members. Priests would give sermons about the spiritual benefits of satya. Neighbours would gather to watch the ceremony, treating it like a festival. Children were brought to witness, learning that women's highest virtue was self-destruction. Even other women participated, sometimes the most vocal supporters of forcing widows to burn. They'd been trapped in the same system. If they'd survived decades of widow misery, why should this woman get to escape? The whole society became complicit. The psychological manipulation was brutal. Families would tell the widow that refusing sati would curse her husband's soul, that her children would suffer karmic consequences, that she'd bring shame on generations of ancestors. They'd describe the spiritual rewards awaiting her in the next life. Meanwhile, they painted her earthly alternatives as worse than death, and in many cases, they were right. The life awaiting a Bengali widow in 1815 was designed to be unbearable. Making death seem like relief was the whole point. By 1815, sati had evolved from rare spiritual choice to systematic elimination of inconvenient women. What started as voluntary religious devotion became a weapon of control. British administrators were starting to document these practices, building evidence for what would become the 1829 ban. But the damage was deep. Entire communities had normalized forcing women to die rather than letting them live independently. This wasn't just about individual families anymore. It was about a society that had forgotten the difference between devotion and murder. The widow's terrible options. Picture this. Early 1800s Bengal region. A woman, maybe 25, watches her husband die, and in that moment, she's faced with a choice that makes no sense to us today. Die on his funeral pyre, or live a life that might make death seem merciful. Here's what we don't understand about Sati. It wasn't always forced. Sometimes women chose it. And when you see what the alternative looked like, you start to understand why the flames might have seemed like freedom. The moment her husband died, a Hindu widow's life as she knew it was over. Gone were the colourful saris, the jewellery, the flowers in her hair. She'd shave her head completely. From now on, only rough white cloth against her skin. 1 meal a day, plain rice, no salt, no spices, nothing that might suggest pleasure or comfort. She'd sleep on a thin mat on the floor, and this wasn't temporary grief. This was forever, until she died, decades later, alone and forgotten. The social death was worse than the physical deprivation. Weddings? She couldn't attend. Festivals? She'd bring bad luck just by showing up. People literally crossed the street to avoid her shadow. They believed a widow's presence could curse a newborn, spoil a harvest, ruin a business deal. Imagine living in a world where everyone you meet sees you as walking misfortune, where your own family treats you like a ghost who just hasn't figured out she's dead yet. If she had no sons to support her, and many didn't, she became unpaid labour for whoever would take her in. Cooking, cleaning, caring for children who weren't hers, getting the scraps of food, the worst corner to sleep in. No autonomy, no respect, no hope things would ever get better. Her in-laws often saw her as a burden, another mouth to feed who brought nothing but shame and bad luck. Some families quietly resented having to keep her alive at all. Then there was the daily humiliation. She'd sit outside temples begging for alms. People would throw coins like they were feeding pigeons, if they bothered at all. Former friends pretended not to recognize her. Servants who once bowed now ordered her around. She went from being someone's beloved wife to being society's unwanted reminder that death exists. Every single day, for the rest of her life, she lived with that social rejection. But here's where it gets complicated. Hindu belief taught that Sati purged karma, that dying on her husband's pyre would cleanse her sins from this life, and countless previous ones. She'd skip straight to a better reincarnation instead of working through lifetimes of suffering. For a woman facing decades of misery, this wasn't just escape, it was spiritual promotion. The ultimate religious logic for ending unbearable circumstances. Suffering now, or transcendence through fire. The community reinforced this thinking constantly. They'd tell stories of Sati widows who became goddesses, whose spirits protected villages, whose courage earned them eternal honour. They'd sing songs about women who chose the flames and achieved instant salvation. Compare that to the alternative, 40 years of being treated like human garbage. When you frame it that way, when everyone around you frames it that way, the choice starts making terrible sense. Now here's what really gets me about this whole thing. The people who benefited most from Sati were often the ones encouraging it. Dead widows don't inherit property. They don't remarry and take resources to new families. They don't live long enough to become expensive burdens. Some families saw Sati as convenient economics disguised as religious honour. The woman's sacrifice solved their financial problems while making them look pious. Win-win except for her. British officials documented how families sometimes pressured widows towards Sati, not with force, that would look bad, but with constant reminders of how miserable her life would be otherwise, how much honour she'd bring the family, how her husband's spirit was waiting for her, psychological manipulation wrapped in religious language. Make the choice seem like her own decision while making the alternative unbearable. Then celebrate her courage when she walked toward the flames. The tragedy is that many of these women genuinely believed they were doing the right thing. They'd internalized the message that their lives had no value without their husbands. That existence as a widow was punishment for sins from past lives. That choosing Sati was noble, brave, spiritually correct. They walked to their deaths convinced they were achieving something beautiful. That's how deeply these systems of control had penetrated their understanding of their own worth. This pattern of making widowhood unbearable, it wasn't unique to India. We see it everywhere in different forms. Victorian England with its poisonous mourning clothes, China with its chastity arches, Africa with widow inheritance. Different cultures, same goal: control women's sexuality, property, and autonomy after their husbands died. Make sure they stayed in line or paid the price. The methods varied, but the message was universal. Widows were dangerous. Widows needed controlling, and sometimes widows needed to disappear entirely. We're jumping from funeral pyres to something completely different. Same outcome though: China, late 1800s. Picture this: your husband dies, you're maybe 25 years old, and suddenly everyone's watching. Will you remarry? Will you honour his memory? Because here's the thing about Chinese widow culture. They had a way to make your choice permanent. Stone arches. Massive, elaborate, beautiful stone arches that would stand for centuries, celebrating your decision to never love again. They called them pyre. Monuments to female sacrifice. These weren't just any monuments. We're talking about architectural masterpieces. Some 3 stories tall, carved with dragons and phoenixes, inscribed with poetry about virtue and devotion. The emperor himself sometimes ordered them built. Communities would raise money for years to afford one, all to honour a woman who chose lifelong celibacy. Think about that for a second. Your entire town pooling resources to celebrate the fact that you'd never experience physical love again. The honour was real, but so was the cost. Here's how it worked. Husband dies. Immediate pressure starts. Your in-laws, neighbours, community leaders, all watching to see what kind of woman you really are. Will you be virtuous? Will you honour his memory? The expectations were crystal clear. Shave your head, wear white, move in with his family permanently, serve his parents until they die, never so much as look at another man. Do this for 10, 20, 30 years, and maybe, just maybe, you'd get your stone arch. But here's what the arch didn't show: the daily reality. You're essentially a servant in your in-laws' house. You wake before dawn, prepare meals, clean, tend to elderly parents who might resent feeding another mouth. You sleep alone, forever. Your friends marry, have children, build lives. You exist, in service. Your own family can't help you. You belong to his family now. The arch celebrates your sacrifice, but you're the one living it, day after day, year after year. The ceremonies for these arches were incredible. Whole villages would attend the dedication. Local officials would give speeches about virtue and moral example. Musicians, food, celebration, your name carved in stone for eternity. Children would learn your story. See that arch? That's for Widow Chen. She loved her husband so much she never remarried. But while everyone's celebrating your virtue, you're standing there in white robes, head shaved, knowing this is your life sentence. Honour tastes pretty bitter sometimes. Life behind the walls of a virtuous widow's house looked exactly like imprisonment. You couldn't travel without permission, couldn't attend festivals, couldn't speak to men outside the family. Your in-laws controlled every aspect of your existence. Some widows were watched constantly, literally followed to market, to ensure they didn't speak inappropriately to vendors. Your virtue was the family's reputation. One moment of human connection, one smile at the wrong person, and decades of sacrifice could be erased. The arch was beautiful. The life... This sounds familiar, right? Remember Victorian widows, locked in their houses for 3 months, wearing toxic black crepe, monitored for appropriate grief, different continent, same control. Whether it's a Chinese widow never remarrying to earn a stone arch, or a Victorian widow suffocating in mourning veils, societies found ways to cage women in the name of honour. The Chinese version just lasted longer, decades instead of years. But the message was identical. Your sexuality is dangerous. Your independence threatens us. Let's talk about what decades of celibacy actually meant. We're not just talking about never marrying again. No physical touch, no companionship, no one to confide in, no shared jokes, shared meals, shared beds. Some of these women lived 40, 50 years after their husbands died. Imagine being 20 when widowed, living to 70, spending 50 years essentially alone in a house full of people who see you as either a burden or a symbol. The arch says virtuous. Reality says slowly dying inside. But what if you cracked? What if you fell in love again? Social annihilation. Your entire family would be disgraced. His family would disown you. The community would shun you. Any children from your first marriage might be forbidden from seeing you. You'd lose everything: home, security, social standing. Some women who remarried were literally driven from their villages. The message was clear: love your dead husband more than your own life. Choose him over yourself, forever. The punishment for choosing happiness was complete social death. Here's what this was really about. Property. Control. When your husband died, you inherited things, maybe land, maybe money, maybe just your children's future inheritance. If you remarried, that wealth might flow to your new husband's family. But if you stayed put, served his parents, raised his children, everything stayed exactly where his family wanted it. Your celibacy wasn't just about virtue. It was about keeping resources in the right hands. Your suffering had a price tag, always did. These stone arches still stand all over China, tourist attractions now, beautiful symbols of female virtue and devotion. But they're also graveyards, monuments to women who buried themselves alive, one decade at a time. And China wasn't unique in finding elaborate ways to control widows. Next, we're heading to traditional African cultures, where widows face different rules, different rituals, but the same underlying message: your life belongs to someone else now. The methods change, the control stays the same. The widow who betrayed her husband. Picture this: a woman in a small African village, early 1900s. Her husband died 3 days ago. The burial's over, the mourners have gone home, and now she faces a choice that will define the rest of her life. Does she honour his memory by staying forever alone? Or does she commit what her community considers the ultimate betrayal, finding love again? Because here's what gets me about this story. It wasn't really about love at all. See, in this culture, a widow remarrying wasn't just moving on. It was an insult to her dead husband's spirit. Like saying he wasn't enough, wasn't worth a lifetime of loyalty. The village elders would whisper about it for decades. Her children might disown her. His family would definitely cut her off completely. And yet, she's maybe 25 years old, no income, 3 kids to feed. What's supposed to happen to her exactly? The answer was widow inheritance. Sounds almost polite when you say it like that, doesn't it? But here's what it really meant. The dead man's brother would take her as his wife, whether she wanted him or not, whether he was already married or not. She'd become essentially property, passed down through the family bloodline. At least she'd have protection and food. At least the kids would stay fed. But wait, there's more. If the brother-in-law didn't want her, or if there wasn't one, she might face something called cleansing rituals. Basically, sleeping with a designated man to purify herself from her husband's death, to wash away the bad luck she was carrying around. Because apparently, a woman whose husband died was contaminated. Dangerous, like death was contagious and she was patient zero. Think about that for a second. Your spouse dies, you're devastated, grieving, and suddenly you're treated like you're cursed. Like his death was somehow your fault. Maybe you didn't pray hard enough. Maybe you didn't serve him well enough. Maybe you brought bad luck into his life. That's the psychological weight these women carried. Grief wasn't enough. They had to carry guilt and shame and fear on top of it. And here's where it gets really twisted. Some communities believed that if a widow remarried someone outside the family, her dead husband's ghost would be angry, like violently angry, angry enough to curse the whole village, bring drought, disease, failed crops, so her personal happiness wasn't just selfish, it was potentially catastrophic. Talk about emotional blackmail. Choose your own life and everyone suffers. No pressure, right? The crazy part is how different villages handled this differently. Some places, widow inheritance was automatic. Others gave her a choice between the brother-in-law staying single forever or leaving the village entirely with nothing. Some required cleansing rituals first. Others skipped straight to shunning her if she even looked at another man. But the common thread, her desires, her feelings, her trauma, none of that mattered. What really gets me is how they framed this as honouring the dead husband, like forcing his widow into an unwanted marriage or a lifetime of celibacy was some beautiful tribute to his memory, when really it was about control, about making sure women couldn't inherit land or accumulate wealth or make independent decisions. The mourning traditions were just the excuse, because here's what nobody talks about in these stories. Some of these widows were relieved their husbands were dead. Some had been in abusive marriages. Some were finally free for the first time in their lives. And then, boom, right back into another system designed to control them. The betrayal wasn't against their dead husbands, it was against a system that needed them powerless. This tradition created impossible choices. Stay loyal to a dead man and watch your children starve. Accept widow inheritance and live with a man you might hate. Undergo cleansing rituals that traumatized you further, or defy everyone, remarry for love, and be branded a traitor to your husband's memory. Every option came with a different kind of suffering. Every choice was somehow wrong. But this African village wasn't unique. Across the world, different cultures found different ways to punish widows for surviving their husbands. In ancient Rome, they took it even further. The Vestal virgins who served the goddess Vesta, if they broke their vows of chastity, they were buried alive. Because apparently, women's sexuality was so dangerous it could anger the gods themselves. African widow rituals. Picture this. It's dawn, 1905, and you're walking through a bustling marketplace in what's now Kenya. The vendors are setting up their stalls, children are running between the baskets of grain, and life seems normal. But if you look closer, you'll notice the women dressed in specific white clothing, heads shaved, sitting quietly at the edges. These are the widows, and what's about to happen to them would make Victorian mourning look like a vacation. Because in many African societies, becoming a widow didn't just mean losing your husband, it meant losing yourself completely, your identity, your freedom, sometimes even your name. The practice was called widow inheritance, and it was as practical as it was devastating. When your husband died, you didn't just grieve, you became property. His brother, his cousin, sometimes even his son from another wife, would inherit you along with the cattle and the land. The reasoning seemed logical to the community. Keep the family together. Keep the children with their father's clan. But for the woman, she had no choice in who would control the rest of her life. But first came the cleansing. Oh, this part's brutal. Many communities believed that death was contagious, that the widow carried her husband's ghost with her, so she had to be purified. In some regions, this meant sitting alone in a hut for weeks while the body decomposed, eating only specific foods, speaking to no one. In others, it meant ritual cleansing with a designated man, often a stranger, who would supposedly wash away the death. The idea was spiritual purification, but the reality was trauma layered on top of grief. The Luo people of Kenya had their own version. When a woman's husband died, she'd be expected to have relations with one of his relatives, or a hired man called a cleanser to drive away evil spirits. Refuse, and you'd be blamed for any bad luck that befell the family. Crops failed, the widow didn't cleanse properly, children got sick, Must be her fault. It was psychological warfare disguised as spiritual protection. And remember, she's doing this while mourning the love of her life. The cruelty is almost incomprehensible. Levirate marriage took this further. If the dead husband had brothers, the widow might be required to marry one of them, not for love, not for companionship, but to keep producing children for the dead husband's lineage. Any sons she bore would be considered her first husband's children, not her new husband's. She became a kind of reproductive vessel for a ghost, and if she refused, in some communities she'd be cast out with nothing, no land, no children, no support. Starvation was a real possibility. Here's what gets me about this system. It wasn't random cruelty, it was economics wrapped in tradition. Women couldn't inherit property in most of these societies. So when a man died, his wealth, his land, his livestock, it all needed to go somewhere. If the widow remarried outside the family, that wealth walked out the door with her. But if she stayed, if she was inherited or cleansed or remarried within the clan, everything stayed put. The family's assets were protected. Her autonomy was the price they paid for financial security. Walk through those domestic spaces where this played out, and you see the complete control. In a traditional compound, the widow's hut might be moved to the edge, marking her changed status. She'd eat different food, wear specific clothing, follow new rules about who she could speak to and when. Her children might be taken away to be raised by relatives deemed more suitable. Even her daily routine, where she could go, what work she could do, all controlled by others. Freedom wasn't even a concept that applied to her anymore. The ceremonial sites tell the whole story. During cleansing rituals, widows would be brought to sacred groves or special huts, often blindfolded or required to keep their eyes down. They couldn't look at the men performing the ceremonies, couldn't speak unless spoken to, couldn't question what was happening to them. These weren't celebrations of transition or mourning, they were demonstrations of power, public displays of how completely a woman's life could be controlled by the community around her. And everyone watched. Everyone knew their place in this system. Remember those concepts of purity we talked about earlier? The same thread runs through African widow traditions. A woman who'd been married was considered spiritually contaminated by her husband's death. She needed cleansing to be pure again. But here's the twisted part. Once she was cleansed, she often couldn't remarry freely anyway. She was pure enough to be inherited by his family, but not pure enough to choose her own future. Purity was just another tool of control, another way to justify taking away her choices. Back in those marketplaces, you could see the result. Widows who'd been through these systems moved differently. They spoke differently. Many seemed to fade into the background, becoming almost invisible. Some had found new husbands within the approved system and learned to make peace with it. Others had been cast out and survived on the margins, selling whatever they could, dependent on charity. A few had escaped to missions or colonial towns where different rules applied, but the majority, they'd learned to disappear while still breathing. This pattern of controlling women through concepts of purity and propriety, it shows up everywhere. And speaking of everywhere, we need to talk about Rome, because if you think African widow rituals were harsh, wait until you hear about the Vestal Virgins. These women took vows of chastity to serve the goddess Vesta. Break those vows, they weren't just shamed or remarried or cleansed, they were buried alive. But that's a story for our next chapter, where sexual impropriety didn't just mean social death, it meant actual death. Roman Vestal Virgins. We're jumping back in time now, way back, ancient Rome, around 700 BCE. Forget Victorian mourning clothes and Indian funeral pyres for a moment. This story's about a different kind of death sentence for women who stepped out of line. These weren't widows, they were virgins, sacred priestesses who served the goddess Vesta. And if they broke their vows, they got buried alive. Yeah, you heard that right, buried alive, in underground chambers while the whole city watched. The Vestal Virgins were Rome's most sacred priestesses. 6 women at a time, chosen as children between ages 6 and 10 from patrician families. Their job? Keep Vesta's sacred flame burning in her temple. This wasn't just any fire. Romans believed if it went out, the empire would fall. No pressure, right? These girls served for 30 years minimum. 10 years learning, 10 years serving, 10 years teaching the newcomers. After that, they could leave, marry, live normal lives, if they survived. Vesta was the goddess of hearth and home. Her cult was ancient, possibly older than Rome itself. The sacred flame represented Rome's eternal life force. It burned continuously for over 1,000 years. The Vestals tended this flame, performed rituals, kept sacred objects safe. They had incredible privileges too. Best seats at gladiator games. They could own property, make wills, testify in court without a male guardian. In a society where women were basically legal children their whole lives, Vestals had real power, but power came with a price. The big one? Chastity. Total, complete celibacy for their entire service. No boyfriends, no flirting, no sexual contact whatsoever. They lived in the house of the Vestals, right in the Forum. Beautiful place, but basically a gilded prison. They couldn't leave without permission, couldn't attend certain festivals. Their whole existence revolved around purity, because if a Vestal broke her vow of chastity, well, that's when things got really, really dark. When Romans suspected a Vestal of breaking her vows, panic set in. This wasn't just scandal, it was national emergency. Military defeats, plagues, floods, earthquakes, all blamed on Vestal impurity. The investigation was intense. Torture of slaves and witnesses, public trials, and if found guilty, the punishment was designed to terrify. Not just execution, something worse, something that would make every woman in Rome think twice about sexual transgression. They called it being buried alive, but it was more calculated than that. Here's how it worked. The guilty Vestal was taken to the Campus Celeratus, the evil field near the Colline Gate. A small underground chamber had been prepared. Stone walls, stone roof, just big enough for one person. They'd lower her down with a rope ladder. She got a small lamp, some bread, water, milk, enough to last maybe a few days. Then they sealed the entrance, covered it with earth. The idea, let the gods decide her fate, while avoiding direct execution. The most famous case happened in 113 BCE. 3 Vestals accused at once, Aemilia, Licinia, and Marcia, a scandal that rocked Rome. Aemilia was executed first. The other 2 were initially acquitted, but public outrage was so intense they faced a second trial under different judges. Both were found guilty, both buried alive. The man accused of seducing one of them, he was beaten to death with rods by the Pontifex Maximus himself. Public spectacle of the highest order. Another case under Emperor Domitian, around 90 CE, the chief Vestal Cornelia, was accused after years of rumours. Domitian made it a public spectacle. She was carried to the burial site in a covered litter, like a bride going to her wedding. Crowds lined the streets. When she stumbled getting out of the litter, she cried out to Vesta, proclaiming her innocence. Didn't matter. Down she went. Her alleged lovers were beaten to death with rods. Justice, Roman style. Why such extreme punishment? Politics and control, mostly. Vestal trials often coincided with political upheavals. Scapegoating women for national problems was convenient. But there's more. Vestals represented female power in a male-dominated society. They had rights other women didn't. Property, independence, influence. Breaking their vows threatened the whole system. If sacred virgins couldn't stay pure, what did that say about controlling ordinary women? The burial punishment sent a clear message about female sexuality and obedience. The economics mattered too. Vestal property went back to the state when they died. Convenient, their families lost influence, and executing them for sexual crimes reinforced the idea that women's bodies belonged to society, not themselves. This wasn't just about religion, it was about power, about keeping women in line through terror. The underground chamber wasn't just a tomb, it was a warning. Step out of line, and society will literally bury you alive. The Vestal tradition lasted over 1,000 years until Emperor Theodosius banned it in 394 CE as part of Christianizing Rome. But the message echoed through history. Women who violated sexual purity codes faced extreme punishment. From Roman burial chambers to Indian funeral pyres to Chinese chastity arches. Different cultures, same theme. Control women's sexuality, control women's power. The Vestals were just one more chapter in humanity's long, dark history of punishing women for being human. The economics of widow control. London, 1724. Margaret Thornton just inherited her merchant husband's entire estate. Warehouses, ships, trading contracts, worth more than some nobles possessed. But here's the thing nobody talks about. The moment that inheritance became hers, she became the most dangerous woman in England, not because she was evil, because she was rich and independent. And suddenly every male relative, every business partner, every neighbour had plans for her money, plans that didn't include her keeping it. Picture this. A widow inherits property. Sounds straightforward, right? Wrong. In 1724 Europe, that inheritance triggered what I call the widow scramble. Brothers-in-law filing lawsuits, distant cousins claiming debts, church leaders suggesting charitable donations, marriage proposals from men who'd never looked twice at her before. Everyone had a strategy. Everyone had a claim, because letting a woman control wealth, that threatened everything. The entire social order depended on keeping economic power in male hands. Here's what gets me about this period. Families developed sophisticated systems to control widow wealth. They'd arrange quick remarriages to suitable men who'd merge the assets back into male control. They'd claim the widow was mentally unstable, unable to manage complex finances. They'd argue debts existed that required selling everything. Sometimes they'd just wait, pressure her until grief and isolation broke her down enough to hand over control willingly. These weren't random acts. This was systematic economic warfare against vulnerable women. The legal system worked against widows too. Courts routinely sided with male relatives in inheritance disputes. Judges questioned women's capacity to understand business. Even when wills clearly left everything to the wife, families could challenge them successfully. They'd argue the husband was coerced or mentally compromised when he wrote the will, or they'd claim mysterious debts that required immediate property sales. The law was supposed to protect inheritance rights. Instead, it became another tool for taking widow wealth away. But here's where it gets really calculated. Societies developed specific traditions around widow sexuality to support economic control. If she remarried too quickly, she was disrespecting her dead husband's memory. If she remarried at all, she was abandoning her children. If she didn't remarry, she was unnaturally cold. See the trap? Every choice became wrong, and behind each judgment was the same goal, keeping that inheritance locked up, controlled by men who knew better how to manage wealth properly. Compare this to what we've already seen, Indian Sati tradition. Economically brilliant for families. Dead widow means her inheritance stays with her husband's relatives instead of following her to a new marriage. Chinese chastity expectations. Same result. Widow stays loyal to deceased husband's family, managing their property as a loyal servant instead of an independent owner. Victorian mourning restrictions. 2 years of social death meant 2 years where she couldn't make business connections or financial decisions independently. Pattern recognition, anyone. The threat of female authority wasn't just social anxiety, it was economic terror. Think about it. If widows could inherit and keep wealth, they'd become power players. They'd own businesses, control trade routes, make political alliances through marriage or business partnerships. They challenged the fundamental assumption that men were naturally better at handling money and power. And honestly, some of them proved exactly that. The successful widow merchants scared everyone because they demonstrated women could thrive independently. Property rights for women were virtually non-existent in most places. Married women couldn't own property separately from husbands under coverture laws. Single women could own property, but faced massive social pressure to marry and transfer everything to their husbands. Widows occupied this weird legal loophole where they temporarily regained property rights. Temporarily, because every legal system, every social tradition, every family pressure worked to close that loophole as quickly as possible. Independence was supposed to be brief. What really strikes me is how global this was. European families fighting over widow inheritance. Chinese families keeping widows dependent through chastity expectations. African families using levirate marriage to keep widow wealth in the clan. Indian families encouraging Sati to prevent remarriage complications. Different methods, same economic goals. Control the woman, control the wealth. Everywhere you look, societies developed sophisticated systems to prevent widows from maintaining economic independence for long. The balance societies claimed to maintain was really just male economic dominance. They argued that women needed protection, that managing wealth was too complex for feminine minds, that children needed stable male figures. But strip away the protective language, and you find economic self-interest. Men maintained control over resources by controlling the women who might inherit them. Widow traditions weren't about honor or morality, they were about money, about keeping wealth circulating through male hands instead of female ones. But some widows broke free, and their stories, that's what we're heading toward next. Women who figured out the game being played against them and found ways to win anyway. Widows who kept their wealth, grew their businesses, and proved that female economic authority wasn't dangerous. It was profitable. They're the reason these control systems eventually started cracking, because when you try to suppress half the population's economic potential, eventually some of them find ways to demonstrate what you're missing. Widows who defied expectations. Picture this. While most widows faced a lifetime of restrictions, some discovered something unexpected. Freedom. Real power. In medieval Europe, a widow could own property, run businesses, make legal decisions, things married women couldn't even dream of doing. The painter Artemisia Gentileschi became more famous and successful after widowhood gave her professional independence. Renaissance Italian widows ran family empires. These women didn't just survive, they thrived. And here's the thing, some of them planned it that way. Medieval Europe had this legal concept called femme sole. Basically, a single woman, including widows, could act as her own legal person. She could sign contracts, own property, sue in court, run businesses. Married women? They legally didn't exist. Their husbands owned everything, made every decision. But when that husband died, suddenly she had rights he'd never had to share with her. Some widows discovered they were actually better off alone. The guild records prove it. Powerful merchant widows everywhere, running the show. Think about the irony here. Society created all these suffocating widow traditions to control women. But those same traditions accidentally created a loophole. A widow couldn't be controlled by a father anymore. He'd already given her away. Couldn't be controlled by a husband. He was dead. So she existed in this weird legal grey area where she actually had more freedom than any other woman in society. Smart widows figured this out fast, and some used it brilliantly. Renaissance Italy was crawling with powerful widow businesswomen. Take the Medici women. After their husbands died, they ran banks, funded artists, made political alliances. Lucrezia Tornabuoni managed the Medici fortune. Clarice Orsini negotiated treaties. These weren't just figureheads, they were making real decisions with real consequences. Venice had widow merchants trading across the Mediterranean. Florence had widow bankers, funding entire city-states. Their mourning clothes might have been black, but their ledger books were definitely in the black too. Here's what gets me. Married women under coverture laws couldn't own a single coin. Everything belonged to their husbands legally, but widows, they inherited the whole estate and could manage it however they wanted. They could invest, expand, sell, buy, total financial autonomy. Some textile businesses in Flanders were entirely run by widows. Silk merchants in Italy, wool traders in England. They weren't just maintaining what their husbands built, they were growing it, improving it, making it bigger and better than before. The really smart ones stayed widows on purpose. Remarriage meant giving up everything again, handing all that power and property to a new husband. So some women just didn't remarry. They claimed they were too devoted to their deceased husband's memory, too heartbroken to love again. Meanwhile, they're running international trading companies and funding cathedrals. Society respected their devotion, while they quietly built business empires. Brilliant strategy, honestly. They found a way to game the system that was trying to control them. The economic records don't lie. Widow merchants were everywhere. London Guild records from the 1400s show hundreds of widows running businesses. They traded everything, spices, textiles, wine, grain. Some owned entire fleets of ships. Agnes Sorel in France controlled a massive trading network. Catherine Swynford in England accumulated wealth that made nobles jealous. These women weren't just surviving their husbands' deaths. They were using widowhood as a launching pad for serious wealth and influence. Pretty incredible when you think about it. Artistic and intellectual freedom came with the territory too. Artemisia Gentileschi painted subjects married women couldn't touch: powerful biblical heroines, female warriors, complex emotional scenes. She charged more for her paintings than most male artists. Widows could patronize controversial artists, fund risky expeditions, support banned books. They had the money and the independence to do whatever interested them. Some became scholars, collectors, even early scientists. Widowhood opened doors that marriage had slammed shut. They weren't just mourning, they were flourishing. Margaret Paston in England managed vast estates, fought legal battles, and basically ran a feudal empire while wearing widow's weeds. Madame de Pompadour gained more influence after becoming a widow than she'd ever had as a mistress. Christine de Pizan, after her husband died young, became Europe's first professional female writer. She supported herself and her children entirely through her writing, something unthinkable for married women. These weren't exceptions. They were part of a pattern. Widowhood meant opportunity if you were brave enough to grab it. These defiant widows actually changed how society viewed women's capabilities. When people saw widows successfully running businesses, managing estates, and making smart financial decisions, it became harder to argue that women were naturally incompetent. Widow success stories spread. Other women took notice. Some even started preparing for potential widowhood by learning business skills while still married. The widow rebels weren't just improving their own lives, they were proving what women could accomplish when given actual freedom and responsibility. Revolutionary stuff for the time. So here's the thing about all those dark widow traditions we've explored. They accidentally created something beautiful. These pockets of light where women discovered they could be powerful, independent, successful. Sure, it came at the cost of losing husbands they loved, but within that grief, some found strength they never knew they had. These widow rebels showed us possibilities, glimpses of what women could achieve when society's usual restrictions loosened just enough. Their stories remind us that even in the darkest systems, some people find ways to shine. How widow traditions finally changed. 1929, 11 years after the Great War ended. Something massive was shifting in how societies treated their widows. The old rules, they were crumbling. In India, reformers had already criminalized Sati. In England and America, those suffocating Victorian mourning periods, getting shorter every year. The war changed everything. When you have millions of young widows who need to work, who need to survive, you can't exactly lock them away in black crepe for 2 years. Reality was dismantling traditions that had controlled women for centuries. The collapse started during the war. Picture this. London, 1918. Factories full of women in simple black armbands. Not elaborate mourning dress. They couldn't afford to stop working for months. They couldn't afford the expensive crepe. And honestly, society needed them functional, not decoratively grief-stricken. By 1920, mourning periods that once lasted 2 years were down to 6 months, sometimes 3. The very practicality of mass widowhood was killing the romantic Victorian notion that proper grief required total social withdrawal. Economics beat tradition every single time. But the biggest changes had started much earlier. India, 1829. Governor William Bentinck signed the order criminalising Sati, one signature, ending centuries of widow burning. Well, legally ending it. But this wasn't some random colonial decision. British reformer William Carey had been documenting cases since 1799. Ram Mohan Roy, the Bengali reformer who'd actually witnessed Sati, spent years building the case. He argued that forcing widows to burn wasn't Hindu tradition, it was corruption of it. Sometimes change needed both insiders and outsiders pushing together, even when the outsiders had questionable motives. Roy's arguments were brilliant. He went straight to the Sanskrit texts, showed that Sati was supposed to be completely voluntary, not coerced. He documented case after case where families tied women down, drugged them, basically murdered them for property inheritance. The British couldn't ignore that evidence. Bentinck later wrote that the decision was one of his proudest achievements. Here's what gets me though. It took an act of colonial law to protect Indian women from their own families. The same colonizers who were exploiting India also ended a practice that killed hundreds of women annually. History's complicated like that. Of course, laws and reality? 2 different things. Sati cases kept happening in princely states where British law didn't reach. Some families just moved the rituals to remote areas. The practice officially ended, but the attitudes behind it, those took generations to change. And here's the dark part. Some women still chose death over the horrible life awaiting them as widows. Social reform moves slower than legal reform. You can ban a practice, but changing the conditions that made women prefer death to widowhood, that's the harder work. And it was barely beginning in 1829. Meanwhile, Victorian mourning was having its own crisis. The 1920s hit like a wrecking ball. Jazz music, shorter skirts, women voting, and shorter mourning periods. Those elaborate mourning rules that Queen Victoria had modelled for 40 years. Suddenly they looked ridiculous. Magazines started calling extended mourning morbid and unhealthy. Doctors were writing about how isolation and depression were actually harmful. The new psychology said grief needed expression, not suppression. Plus, all that expensive mourning clothing, completely impractical for women entering the modern workforce. Fashion was literally setting widows free. The numbers tell the story. Before the war, mourning clothing was a massive industry. Specialized shops, detailed etiquette books, professional mourning consultants. By 1925, most of those businesses were gone. Women were buying regular black dresses, adding simple armbands, getting back to their lives. The 3-month seclusion period, practically extinct. Society needed functioning women, not decorative grievers. And here's the kicker. Some older women were scandalized. They'd suffered through years of mourning isolation and couldn't understand why younger widows got off so easy. Change always creates generational tension. But not every culture was ready for change. Chinese families still built those chastity arches for widows who never remarried. African communities still practiced widow inheritance. Some Hindu families found ways around the Sati ban through social pressure and economic isolation. Orthodox communities doubled down, treating reform as dangerous Western influence. This is where it gets messy. Some traditions strengthened in response to modernization. When your culture feels under attack, you cling harder to the old ways. Progress wasn't a straight line. It was 2 steps forward, 1 step back, with plenty of regional variation and cultural resistance along the way. The speed of change depended entirely on location and class. Urban, educated women, they got freedom faster. Rural, traditional communities, change took decades longer. Wealthy widows had always had more options. Poor widows, they'd always been more vulnerable to family pressure and economic manipulation. The reforms often helped the women who needed them least first. Classic pattern. Still, legal changes created precedents. Once you establish that widows have rights, that mourning has limits, that women can't be forced into death or lifetime isolation, those precedents spread. Slowly, unevenly, but they spread. Here's what nobody expected. Some of these changes backfired on women. Shorter mourning periods meant less social protection. Victorian widows, for all their restrictions, got a guaranteed period where nobody could pressure them to remarry. When that disappeared, some widows faced immediate pressure to find new husbands. Indian widows might be safe from Sati, but they still faced social death if they remarried. And working women, they were earning money but also losing the economic support that mourning traditions had provided. Freedom came with new vulnerabilities. Progress is never clean. It creates new problems while solving old ones. By 1929, the landscape was completely different. Widows in major cities could work, date, remarry without major scandal. The deadly traditions were mostly gone. The suffocating restrictions were loosening. But something interesting was happening too. Some widows weren't just surviving these changes, they were thriving in them, finding power in their new independence, building businesses, entering politics, becoming forces in their communities. The very women that centuries of tradition had tried to control or eliminate. They were about to become some of the most powerful figures of the 20th century, the widow warriors. Here's where the story flips completely. Because while most widows faced restrictions, erasure, or death, some found something unexpected in their loss. Power. Real, tangible, life-changing power. These weren't women who just survived widowhood. They weaponized it, turned their grief into gold, their mourning into momentum. From medieval Europe to Renaissance Italy, certain widows discovered that losing a husband could mean gaining everything they'd never been allowed to have while married. Freedom, property rights, business control, and they weren't about to give it back. Medieval Europe. Strange place for women's liberation, right? But here's what happened when a woman's husband died. She became what lawyers called femme sole, literally a woman alone, and alone meant independent. No coverture laws, no husband's permission needed for anything. She could own property, sign contracts, sue in court, run businesses. Everything that had been legally impossible as a married woman suddenly became possible as a widow. Some of these women looked around at their newfound freedom and thought, why would I ever remarry and lose all this? Medieval guilds. Male-dominated, obviously, except for the widows. When a guild master died, his widow could inherit his membership, not just inherit his tools or his shop, his actual position in the guild. She could train apprentices, vote on guild policies, control trade regulations. In London's Brewing Guild, widows ran some of the most successful operations. They weren't just keeping their husbands' businesses alive, they were expanding them, growing them, proving that maybe, just maybe, women had been capable of running things all along. Artemisia Gentileschi. Baroque painter, incredibly talented, but as a married woman in 17th century Italy, she needed her husband's permission for everything. Gallery showings, commissions, even selling her own work. Then he died, and suddenly she didn't need anyone's permission anymore. She became the most successful painter in Naples, charged higher fees than most male artists, painted for kings and popes, had international clients begging for her work. Widowhood didn't end her career, it launched it into the stratosphere. Her best paintings came after losing her husband. Renaissance Italy was full of powerful widow merchants. Lucrezia Tornabuoni ran the Medici bank operations after her husband's death. Alessandra Strozzi managed one of Florence's largest textile businesses while raising 5 children. These women weren't just maintaining family enterprises, they were expanding them, negotiating international trade deals, managing hundreds of employees. Some historians think the Renaissance economy would have collapsed without widow entrepreneurs. They had the experience from watching their husbands, but now they had the legal authority to act on their own vision. Some widows made a strategic choice: stay single forever, because remarrying meant legal suicide. The moment they said "I do" again, everything transferred to the new husband. Property, businesses, decision-making power, gone. So wealthy widows would take lovers instead of husbands, have relationships without legal consequences. They'd been married once for duty, now they could choose pleasure without sacrificing power. These women created a whole alternative lifestyle, love without losing everything. Independence with intimacy on their own terms. Revolutionary for the time. The economics were brutal but simple. Married women legally owned nothing. Widows could own everything. Land, shops, ships, warehouses, all the wealth their husbands had accumulated suddenly belonged to them alone. And here's the thing nobody expected. Many of these widows turned out to be better at business than their dead husbands had been. They negotiated harder, managed money more carefully, expanded into new markets. Death records from medieval London show widow-run businesses had higher survival rates than male-owned ones. Grief, apparently, was excellent for the bottom line. Guild records tell the story. In Paris, widow brewers controlled 30% of the beer trade by 1400. In London, widow grocers dominated spice imports. In Florence, widow bankers managed some of the largest loans in Europe. These women weren't just participating in business, they were running entire industries. They formed networks, shared information, protected each other's interests. Some married off their daughters strategically to connect widow-led businesses across cities. They built economic dynasties that lasted generations, all starting from the moment their husbands died. Legal documents from the period are fascinating. Widows suing for payment, negotiating contracts, buying and selling property with complete authority. Things that would have been impossible as married women. They appear in court records as plaintiffs, defendants, witnesses. They're making decisions about investments, trade routes, employee wages. Reading these documents, you almost forget these women had been legally invisible just years before. Widowhood didn't just give them money, it gave them agency, the right to exist as full legal persons for the first time in their lives. The paradox is devastating. These women had to lose everything that mattered personally to gain everything that mattered legally. They traded love for liberation, companionship for control. Many of them were genuinely grieving while simultaneously discovering freedoms they'd never imagined possible. Some historians call it the widow's dilemma, mourning your loss while celebrating your gain, crying for your dead husband while secretly reveling in the power his death had given you. They were warriors precisely because they turned their greatest loss into their greatest weapon. These widow warriors proved something crucial. Women had always been capable of running businesses, managing money, making complex decisions. They just hadn't been allowed to. The moment legal restrictions lifted, even temporarily through widowhood, they excelled. They didn't need training or preparation, they needed permission. And death, ironically, had given them that permission. Their success planted seeds that would eventually grow into women's rights movements centuries later. But first we need to see how these ancient patterns echo in surprising ways today. Modern echoes. Here we are in the 21st century. Women can vote, own property, run companies, yet somehow ancient widow traditions still haunt us. Walk through rural India and you'll find shrines at Sati sites where women burned alive centuries ago. Visit traditional Chinese families where grandmothers still whisper that remarriage brings shame. Turn to Western societies where we've supposedly moved past all this. But watch how people react when a widow starts dating too soon. These shadows are everywhere once you start looking. Let's start in India. The British banned Sati in 1829. That's almost 200 years ago. Yet today, you can still find temples built where women once burned. Devotees bring flowers, light incense, pray for blessings from these pure souls. The Rajasthani government actually maintains some of these sites as cultural heritage. Think about that. Places where women died horrific deaths, now tourist attractions. The reverence continues. The mythology that these women chose honour over life. It's deeply embedded in how some communities still view widowhood. China tells a similar story. Those memorial arches we talked about, they're still standing. Monuments to women who never remarried, never found love again, never chose their own path. And in traditional families, especially rural ones, the pressure continues. Good women don't remarry. Think of your children. What will people say? Modern Chinese widows report family interventions when they try dating. Social media posts about bringing shame to ancestors. Ancient ideas dressed up in contemporary language. The chains are invisible now, but they're still there. Western societies aren't immune either. We just hide it better. No formal mourning periods, no burial alive, no funeral pyres. But the whispers? They're still there. She moved on quickly. Already dating. What about the kids? Watch how differently we treat widows versus widowers. Men who remarry fast get called practical. Women get called selfish. The expectations are subtler now, softer, but they're woven into our social fabric so deeply we barely notice them unless we're the ones living through it. Modern restraint, ancient roots. And then there's something so simple, so universal. We don't even question it anymore. Black, the colour of mourning, Victorian England's gift to the world. Walk into any funeral today, anywhere on the planet, black clothes, black cars, black everything. Queen Victoria's 40 years in mourning didn't just change one empire, it rewrote global grieving. Before the Victorians, mourning colours varied wildly. White in China, purple in ancient Rome, bright colours in many African cultures. Now, black everywhere. One queen's grief became humanity's standard. That's cultural power. The Victorian echoes go deeper than colour choices. That idea that grief has a timeline? Victorian. The belief that moving on too fast shows disrespect? Victorian. The assumption that proper mourning requires visible suffering? Also Victorian. We've shortened the expected mourning period from 2 years to, well, there's no official time frame now, but the judgment remains. The silent scorecards. People tracking how long someone wears their wedding ring when they change their Facebook status, whether they smile in photos. We've modernized widow surveillance, not eliminated it. So here we are, looking back at centuries of traditions designed to control, restrict, and sometimes eliminate widows entirely. Sati in India, crepe poisoning in Victorian England, widow inheritance in Africa, memorial arches in China, burial alive in ancient Rome. Different cultures, different methods, same result. Women's autonomy sacrificed on the altar of social control, property ownership, sexuality, independence, all too dangerous to leave in women's hands. Widowhood made women visible in their power, so societies invented ways to make them invisible again, or just gone. But here's what gives me hope. The fight for women's autonomy never stopped, not completely. Even when the restrictions were deadliest, there were women who said no, who refused the pyre, ignored the mourning rules, remarried despite the shame, built businesses despite the barriers. The Victorian widow who threw off her veil early, The Hindu woman who escaped the flames, the Chinese widow who found love again, small rebellions that cracked the foundations. Each no made the next one easier. Each woman who chose herself over tradition paved the way. The resilience of women through all of this, it's staggering. Imagine facing your husband's death and knowing society expected you to essentially die too. Socially, economically, sometimes literally, yet women found ways to survive, to thrive, to protect their children, to build new lives from the ashes of their old ones. They turned restrictions into opportunities, used widowhood's unique legal status to gain property rights, leveraged mourning periods to escape unwanted remarriages, found power in the very spaces meant to contain them. Absolutely remarkable. Yet traditions that pigeonhole women into accepting lifelong punishments for the crime of outliving their husbands, they persist. Sometimes in laws, often in social pressure, always in whispered expectations. The widow who's too independent, the woman who dates too soon, the mother who prioritizes her happiness over endless sacrifice. We've traded funeral pyres for Facebook judgment, mourning veils for social media scrutiny. The tools changed, the control impulse didn't. We're still uncomfortable with women who refuse to disappear into grief, still suspicious of widows who want more than survival. And that's the hardest truth here. How difficult it is to eradicate deep-seated societal norms. Laws can change overnight. Hearts and minds, that takes generations. We banned Sati, abolished formal mourning periods, granted women legal equality, but the underlying belief that women should sacrifice themselves for others, that runs deeper than legislation. It's in our stories, our assumptions, our instinctive reactions. Yet every woman who chooses herself, who refuses the old scripts, who writes her own ending, she's part of changing that story, one choice at a time.